Imagine you uncover a state-sponsored manual. Right. One designed to completely program the minds of an entire generation.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, and it's this official government document. And on the cover, explicitly marked, it says, not for sale.
Which is always a good hook.
Right. So you open it up and you're expecting to find, standard instructions,
Yeah.
rules of grammar, historical dates, maybe some civic laws.
Sure, just standard textbook stuff.
Exactly. But there's a problem. The digital file we have is corrupted. Every single paragraph, all the vocabulary words, every instructional sentence has just been scrambled into these unreadable, chaotic symbols. The literal text is entirely gone.
That sounds frustrating.
It is, but here's the crazy part. The pictures survived.
Ah, okay. Which leaves us in a really fascinating position, actually.
Right. Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. We are conducting a piece of, educational archaeology today.
Mm.
Our artifact is a primary school document from Pakistan, published back in 2009.
Yeah, and specifically, it was part of the Punjab Education Sector Reform Program, or you'll hear it referred to as the PSRP.
Right, the PSRP.
And, to understand the stakes of that document, we really have to look at the context of 2009. Because the PSRP wasn't just like a minor curriculum update. Punjab is Pakistan's most populous province.
Right.
So in the late 2000s, the region was undergoing this massive, heavily funded overhaul of its public education system. I mean, the goal was to standardize learning, boost literacy rates, and just fundamentally modernize how millions of children were being taught in public schools.
So this document we're looking at, it was a major piece of a very large, very serious bureaucratic machine.
Absolutely.
But, because of that digital corruption in the file we obtained, we're skipping the reading comprehension lessons entirely. We're going to focus purely on the visual curriculum. And I
Yeah.
really want you, the listener, to think about the mechanics of how a worldview is actually built.
Yeah, because we often assume it's the text in a textbook that shapes a student.
Exactly. But today, we're looking at the underlying psychological blueprint, like the cultural, national, and aspirational DNA being passed down to these Pakistani students purely through the sequence of images.
It's powerful stuff. When you strip away the text, you remove the rationalization. You don't get the essay explaining, why a student should value a certain thing.
Right, you just get the raw association.
Exactly. You see what the state considers fundamental, what it considers a threat, and what it envisions for the future.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's look at how this document establishes its foundation. If you're designing a curriculum for young kids, you might assume the first few pages would sort of ease them into the school environment.
Sure. Maybe an illustration of a teacher at a chalkboard.
Right, or kids playing in a schoolyard. But this document does not do that. It opens with intense spiritual gravity.
Oh, yeah. Very intense.
The very first illustrations plunge the student straight into the holiest sites of Islamic heritage.
Yeah, we see this highly detailed imagery of the Kaaba in Mecca. The massive black cube surrounded by throngs of pilgrims in white.
It's striking.
It really is. And following that is an illustration of the iconic green dome of the Prophet's Mosque in Medina.
So the visual message there feels incredibly clear. It's saying your core identity, before you are a student, before you are literally anything else, is rooted in this ancient spiritual lineage.
Right.
But then what happens on the very next page is, honestly, it's jarring. We go immediately from the quiet, profound reverence of Mecca to the loudest, heaviest machinery of national defense.
Yeah, the visual transition is abrupt. I mean, we move straight to illustrations of Pakistan Air Force fighter jets in mid-flight.
Just right there on the page.
Yeah, displaying the National Star and Crescent. And then columns of soldiers marching in camouflage with these bright red berets.
And a tank, right.
Yes, finally, a heavy military tank painted in green camo, just dominating the frame.
So, okay, how do those two concepts belong in the same introductory lesson? I mean, you have the spiritual epicenter of a global religion sitting directly next to a camouflage tank.
It's a stark contrast.
It feels like they're throwing two completely different jigsaw puzzles onto the same table. It's like looking at a nation's cultural DNA strand. On one side, you have this profound spiritual devotion, and on the other, physical fortification. Are these textbooks functioning as a sort of shield for the students? Like building both spiritual and physical borders at the exact same time?
That's a great way to put it. And this is where we really have to look at the mechanics of associative learning in a child's brain, especially within the historical context of Pakistan in 2009.
Right, because things were tense.
Very tense. At that time, the country was dealing with severe internal and external security crises. The state was fighting intense insurgencies. Survival and national defense weren't just, abstract concepts to memorize. They were daily headline realities.
So for a curriculum designer, the goal isn't just to inform the student that the military exists.
No, not at all. The goal is to transfer that unshakable, sacred reverence the child holds for their faith directly onto the institutions of the state.
Wow. So by placing the Prophet's mosque next to a fighter jet, the book bypasses logical debate entirely.
Exactly. It relies on cognitive proximity. It creates a psychological tether.
Because if you tell a child, you must respect the military because they protect our geopolitical interests, that requires complex reasoning.
Way too complex for a kid.
I-
But if you place a tank in the exact same visual sequence as the Kaaba, the child's brain automatically assigns the same emotional weight to both.
The mechanism is associative transfer.
Right. Defending the physical borders becomes a sacred duty, basically on par with religious devotion. Faith and the fortress are presented as these dual pillars that keep the sky from falling.
Man, that is fascinating. So once that psychological perimeter is established and, the spiritual center and the heavily guarded borders, the curriculum moves inward. The next sequence of images focuses on the land itself and the people living inside those borders.
And the topography it presents is incredibly vast.
It really is. The illustrations map out this massive geographical range. We see isolated snow-covered mountain villages and a red chairlift suspended over these dense green forests, which clearly represents the northern territory.
Yeah, the northern areas.
Right. Then you turn the page, and the climate and energy completely flip. We're suddenly looking at dense, chaotic urban centers, throngs of people navigating busy bazaars, multi-story buildings packed tightly together.
It's a very stark contrast to the quiet mountain peaks.
Totally. And the people are just as varied. There's this one specific sequence featuring 4 young boys, and each one is dressed in highly distinct regional clothing.
Yeah, and we have to note that the semiotics of clothing in South Asia are highly specific. The visual markers are immediate identifiers of ethno-linguistic backgrounds.
Right, so we see one boy in a bright yellow kurta with a heavily patterned dark waistcoat. Another is in a crisp white shalwar kameez, but he stands out because of a bright red waistcoat and a really vivid, elaborate green turban.
Yeah.
And the other 2 boys feature varying shades of orange and blue, utilizing completely different styles of traditional headwear.
And, to a local reader, those aren't just colorful outfits. Those specific folds of a turban or the cut of a waistcoat represent distinct provinces. They're signaling Punjabi, Sindhi, Balakh, or Pashtun heritage.
Okay, so this actually makes me wonder about the friction of nation building, because Pakistan has a pretty complex history regarding regional identities and provincial tensions, right?
Absolutely. It's a major historical through line.
So we see all these different outfits in varying climates. It's kind of like a small world ride. But by highlighting these deep, stark differences so prominently in a primary textbook, isn't the state risking reinforcing tribalism? Is the curriculum celebrating differences? Or is it trying to forcefully stitch together a singular national identity from threads that might otherwise pull apart?
Well, it seems like a risk on the surface, but the cognitive strategy here is visual subsumption.
Visual subsumption.
Yeah. In a multi-ethnic state, if a national curriculum only depicts one dominant cultural group, minority groups immediately feel alienated.
Right, they don't see themselves.
Exactly. And that alienation breeds resentment, which is the actual threat to national unity. The visual mechanism at work here acknowledges the local identity in order to safely absorb it into the national identity.
Oh, I see. It's the visual equivalent of a roll call.
Precisely. By depicting the boy from the snowy mountains right alongside the boy from the urban bazaar, the book is telling the student, your local reality is valid.
But they're all in the same book.
Right, because all these boys are printed on the same page, bound in the same government-issued book, and protected by the same fighter jets we saw earlier, their local identities are downgraded to subcategories.
Wow.
The overarching category is Pakistani. It neutralizes the threat of separatism by making diversity a feature of the state rather than a threat to it.
That makes the sequence function less like a tourist brochure and more like a carefully negotiated peace treaty. Like, you are allowed to wear your regional turban as long as you recognize you stand under the same national roof.
Well put. And once you establish who the citizens are, you have to teach them how to function together.
Which brings us to the civic engine of the country. So the deep dive shifts from identity to daily action. We get illustrations of the mundane rhythm of the economy.
Everyday life.
Yeah, we see formal gardens with brick archways, neat rows of crops on rural farms, a local barber giving a man a haircut, someone washing clothes by hand on a wooden board.
Just very standard, relatable scenes.
Right, children doing morning calisthenics in a park and playing cricket. But here's where it gets really interesting. Right in the middle of these everyday, unremarkable scenes, we find the single piece of text that somehow survived the digital corruption.
It's a fascinating anomaly in the document.
It is. Sitting there in perfectly legible English amidst a sea of scrambled symbols is the phrase, All Pakistan Women's Association.
Just glowing there.
Like a glowing clue in a video game. It's surrounded by pictures of kids playing sports and guys getting haircuts. Why would a specific women's civic group be elevated to the level of a core curriculum lesson for kids, embedded right next to a cricket match?
So in the study of visual semiotics, we refer to this kind of placement as an anchor point. And to understand its function, we need the background of the organization itself.
Okay, tell us about them.
The All Pakistan Women's Association, or APWA, is this historic, highly influential nonprofit. It was founded shortly after the creation of Pakistan in 1947.
It's been around a while.
Yeah, and its mandate was the social, moral, and economic welfare of women. I mean, it was instrumental in drafting family laws and pushing for women's educational and civic rights.
So it carries massive historical and political weight. But wait, these are primary school students? They aren't studying constitutional law.
Which is exactly why the associative placement is so brilliant.
Huh.
If the curriculum presented, like, a dense text explaining the philosophical necessity of women's rights in a developing economy, it would invite debate. It would frame the issue as a political question.
Because it's suddenly an argument.
Right. But by visually sandwiching the All Pakistan Women's Association between a barbershop and a farm, the curriculum designers are bypassing the political debate entirely.
Oh, man. They're using the mundane to camouflage the progressive.
Yes. They are leveraging cognitive normalization. When a young child, whether a boy or a girl, sees a women's civic organization listed alongside the most boring, standard facts of daily life, their brain categorizes it as a settled issue.
It's just a given.
Exactly. It tells the student that women organizing, mobilizing, and participating in the civic sphere is just the normal background noise of their society.
It essentially bakes gender participation into the civic DNA before the child is even old enough to know what a civic duty is.
It's highly effective.
That is an incredibly subtle way to engineer social norms. But just as the student gets comfortable in this rhythm of farming, washing clothes, and local community life, the document initiates a massive, almost aggressive leap forward.
Oh, yeah. The transition from the agrarian present to the technological future is probably the most dramatic visual shift in the entire curriculum.
It's wild. We literally turn the page from someone washing clothes on a rock to massive, heavy industry. There's a sprawling factory complex with towering smokestacks pumping out
It's
exhaust.
just a complete aesthetic shift.
From there, it's a relentless parade of industrial technology. We see a classic red and green passenger bus, a powerful train engine, a huge PIA Pakistan International Airlines jet in flight.
Moving fast.
Yeah. Then we zoom into domestic life and find a modern refrigerator, an electric clothing iron, an incandescent light bulb, and a bright red rotary telephone.
So the document is really cataloging the tools of modernization here, but it doesn't stop at household appliances.
No, it accelerates. And this is the sequence that really requires some analysis. We are presented with a highly detailed, reverent portrait of a classical Islamic scholar.
Right.
He has a long beard, a traditional turban, and is dressed in flowing robes, looking like a figure from centuries past.
A very classical image.
But immediately following that portrait is an illustration of a desktop computer setup, monitor, tower, keyboard, mouse.
Which is a jump.
A huge jump. And following the computer is an illustration of an astronaut in a full pressurized spacesuit standing on the surface of the moon.
It is a breathtaking trajectory to put in front of a young student.
It really is. So what does this all mean? We literally go from a guy washing clothes on a rock to an astronaut walking on the moon. It's giving me major World's Fair vibes. Isn't this an incredibly jarring leap for a student to make in one book? Are they saying the traditional way of life is obsolete?
Well, that is the perpetual danger for developing nations undergoing rapid industrialization.
It causes anxiety, right?
Huge anxiety. Modernity often arrives dressed in Western aesthetics. It can feel like a foreign import that threatens traditional values. If a curriculum just shows a computer and a spaceship, the traditional student might reject it as something completely outside their cultural identity.
Because it doesn't look like their world.
Right, and this is why the classical scholar is the key to the entire sequence.
Ah, the scholar serves as a bridge.
He acts as the cognitive permission slip. By placing the classical, historical figure of Islamic learning directly before the modern computer, the curriculum designers are actively managing the friction between tradition and progress.
That makes so much sense.
They are drawing an unbroken historical line from the golden age of Islamic scientific inquiry straight to the silicon chip and space exploration.
They're telling the student, this technology isn't a Western intrusion. This is your own heritage, just in a new form.
Exactly. It neutralizes the cognitive dissonance. It teaches the child that they do not have to choose between their faith and the future. Embracing technocracy, engineering, and scientific exploration is framed as the ultimate realization of their historical identity.
It takes the potential fear of the future and turns it into an inheritance. That's brilliant.
Right.
You know, when you pull back and look at the entire visual journey of this 2009 PESRP document, you realize the staggering ambition of a public education system.
It's massive.
We often reduce schooling to the transfer of basic skills, right? Like, can you read this sentence? Can you solve this math problem? But based purely on the visual evidence we decoded today, this curriculum was a carefully engineered roadmap.
A highly engineered sociological blueprint. The intent of the designers is mapped out perfectly in the imagery.
Yeah.
They were attempting to forge a very specific type of citizen, a child who is unshakably rooted in their Islamic faith, intensely patriotic, and aware of the need for national defense.
Right, the tank and the mosque.
Exactly, but also tolerant of regional ethnic diversity as a component of state unity, completely normalized to women's civic participation, and technologically ambitious enough to see themselves in space.
And all of that heavy lifting was being done in the margins, alongside the alphabet. It really makes you reconsider the environment of your own childhood.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, I want you to think about the textbooks you were handed in the 3rd or 4th grade. While you were focused on memorizing the capital of your state or struggling through long division, your brain was constantly processing the visual architecture built around those lessons.
Because we absorb societal rules through visual osmosis long before we can actually articulate them.
Exactly.
The illustrations in our early textbooks quietly draw the boundaries around what we consider normal behavior, acceptable careers, and just societal priorities in general.
Were the pictures in your math book subtly priming you to be an obedient worker in a cubicle? Were the illustrations in your history book coding you to view certain nations as perpetual allies and others as inherent threats? We rarely question the images because they feel like mere decorations.
But as we've seen today, there is no such thing as an accidental picture in a state-sponsored textbook.
No. Visual literacy requires us to interrogate the background. Sometimes the most powerful arguments a society makes are the ones it never bothers to put into words.
That's very true.
Which leaves us with a fascinating thought experiment. I want you to imagine an archaeologist from the year 3000, or perhaps an alien visitor, digging through the ruins of our civilization.
I love this.
Right. So they unearth the current school textbook that your child or your neighbor's child carried in their backpack today. But just like the corrupted file we explored in this deep dive, all the text has faded away.
Gone completely.
Yeah. There is no language left to explain our laws, our philosophies, or our excuses. They're only the pictures. Based entirely on the visual sequences left behind in those pages, what would that future historian conclude about what our society actually worshipped, what we feared, and what we were trying to program our children to become?